If one does not wish for Donald Trump and his vision of America to succeed, it must compel you to be more introspective. The idea that you would say that now is not the time to think about those things strikes me as bizarre if you're actually trying to win back political power.
Well, hello out there in podcast land. This is a new edition of the Liberal Patriot Podcast. I'm your host, Ruy Teixeira, and I come at you every couple of weeks or so with the very finest in heterodox conversation and analysis, with the most interesting and stimulating guests. And today I'm exceptionally pleased to have Thomas Chatterton Williams. Thomas is a non-resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where I hang out too, pretty much. So, you know, we're like two peas in a pod. And he's a staff writer at The Atlantic. He's a visiting professor of the humanities and a senior fellow at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. He's a member of the Board of Trustees of the American Academy in Berlin, a 2022 Guggenheim Fellow, and probably a number of other things that I'm not mentioning here, but are all pretty great, I'm sure. But what we're really going to talk about is not all his many accomplished previous affiliations and current affiliation, but rather what he's done lately in terms of the literary output department. And he has a new book out, Summer of Our Discontent, The Age of Uncertainty, The Demise of Discourse. Just came out in August. Highly recommended. And his previous two books were Self-Portrait in Black and White, Unlearning Race, it's 2019, and Losing My Cool, Love Literature, and A Black Man's Escape from the Crowd. And that was from 2011. Both of which I've read and both of which I strongly recommend. So, you know, the moment you get off this podcast, you should just like rush over to Amazon and order all three of his books. But before that, we're going to talk a little bit about Thomas's work and, of course, particularly his newest book. So, Summer of Our Discontent. It's been 5 years since that summer, and we're still at each other's throats. I think that's fair to say. Left excesses breed right excesses, which breed more left excesses, breed more right excesses. Seemingly endless dysfunctional feedback loop. So, like, what happened that summer? You know, why was that summer a cut point when you could see a lot of these debates and problems and, you know, screaming at each other? It did have a prior presence as well. It had been evolving for a while. What was it about that summer that made it a true cut point, and in your view?
Well, first of all, it's so good to be with you, Ruy. Thanks for having me on. That summer,
the honor is all mine.
I think that summer, you can only understand it, obviously, in the context of a confluence of events that came together. And first and foremost, there's the pandemic. Normal life came to a halt, not just in America, but throughout the world. In American life, people were in many states quarantined or on lockdown, trying to flatten the curve, engaging reality through these supercomputers, as Matthew Continetti called them, that we keep in our pockets. You know, we're all in this kind of homogenous mediated reality, oftentimes social mediated reality. And then we were met with the spectacle of a truly jarring and alarming death in Minneapolis on May 25th, 2020, the death of George Floyd, which I think grabbed attention in a way that previous shootings that were videotaped did not, because of the length, the duration of Derek Chauvin having knelt on his back and suffocated him, asphyxiated him. This really captivated the nation's attention at a time that had a lot of attention to give. And so, you know, that summer, you saw a lot of ideas that had been percolating for a while, I would say, since at least Obama's second term, 2012,
I think that's
2013.
Right.
These ideas, Black Lives Matter, this idea that America was not, in fact, headed towards a post-racial kind of future, but in fact was structurally, systemically racist and unjust. These ideas broke through at a moment where there was very much a need to rebel against something. The pandemic is very interesting because you had on the right for some weeks at that point, you had kind of sporadic rebellions and protests against stay-at-home orders. Right. This was disreputable on the left. It was associated with MAGA, and with illiberalism.
Yeah, and nothing could be worse than being out in the streets.
Exactly. You were a grandmother
What's wrong with
killer.
these people?
Right. You're killing grandmothers.
Right.
From one day to the next, though, in fact, it was considered a new conventional wisdom that structural racism was another form of pandemic. And in fact, we couldn't risk ourselves staying at home. We had to be in the streets to rebel against that. And from one day to the next, it kind of flipped. And it was, we were shaming people for not being in the streets. And so that kind of was an outlet, a pressure release, I think, for an urge that was universally felt to rebel based on the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, how did people talk themselves into this stuff, though? I just remember going through this when it was happening and thinking, like, what are these people saying? This makes no sense. And not only that, if you objected to it, like, hey, these two things, they don't go together, do not compute. It's like you were in danger, significant danger of being attacked and accused of being a tool of the racist power structure, what have you. And it's just like, all of a sudden, all of my faith in the sort of fundamentals of liberal discourse, that even if it went occasionally off the rails, it was still basically on the right track. I just felt like I'd been hit sort of in an intellectual sense in the side of my head with a 2x4. This was just like gobsmacking. I mean, people would said one stupid, indefensible thing after another. And they were perfectly willing to shout you down if you disagreed. So, how did people talk themselves into it so fast? How did they discard their norms so quickly? And I think you allude to this in your book. There's a certain amount of hustling going on there in terms of people essentially benefiting from weaponizing this kind of a social justice issue against other people, and it quickly got out of control. And to this day, I feel like I don't completely understand how it happened so far so fast.
Well, there's a few things, right? Part of what is basically the term we're stuck with is wokeness. What is referred to as wokeness, social justice, activism, whatever we want to call it. Part of why it has been so compelling is because it's at least partially true, right? There really are histories of oppression and inequalities, and we really can look around our society, and it's quite inegalitarian in many ways. And we can see that, Me Too showed that there are dimensions to gender in the workplace that oftentimes straight men don't see, that women don't have the comfort always to go out for a drink with their boss and make the kind of informal network connections that their peers do because their boss might be hitting on them. There was kind of an awareness that not everything had been solved, that that society may have been improving incrementally, but it was not yet nearly as perfected as it ought to be. So these kind of half truths that something is still wrong, I think that they broke through at a time when we had been promised that liberalism was reaching its kind of endpoint. I really do think that this is why the book starts with the kind of the hope that Obama had originally generated.
Yeah, no, and you were swept up in that too, right, Thomas?
Yeah.
You were
very much so.
And yeah.
I mean, I really think that, it seemed like we were perfecting the liberal project, and that he was delivering a kind of not just post-racial, but Hillary Clinton was going to succeed him as well, and everything was being sorted out. All of these problems would not necessarily be with our children that we had inherited from our parents. That kind of hope and that kind of expectation, when dashed, I think it was unbearable, and it led to a kind of blooming discontent on the left that became in the 2010s a kind of reason for being, right? That social injustice was everywhere around us, and that was the lens through which we should see all kind of public life, even private life, and that power dynamics were always at play, and that people were part of groups that had grievances, and that when one group had more power than another group, or one group oppressed another group, everything had to be directed at equalizing that power imbalance or righting that oppression. And I think that that's how some of these ideas that started out making some sense got taken to such far and not at all foregone conclusions that we started to create the conditions for the backlash that we're living through right now. Yeah,
I mean, so that's a fairly generous interpretation in a way. It's like there was a rational kernel to the whole thing. People had a not unreasonable set of things they were concerned about, and then it kind of gets out of control. But again, we come back to the why question, the how question. Your analysis. I mean, what do you think of Musa Al-Gharbi's interpretation? If you're familiar with it,
yes, I reviewed that.
Oh, you reviewed the book? Yeah. Okay,
yeah, I really liked it.
Yeah, and he basically argues it ain't no accident. I mean, this is basically like it's kind of a class thing. These symbolic capitalists really benefit from promulgating this kind of ideology and outpointing each other on that basis and trying to secure, various positions on that basis and, signaling to everybody else they're part of the right class. So does he overdo it, do you think? Or is that at least a good chunk of what's going on here? The rise of the professional managerial class and in its current iteration. And
I don't think he overdoes it. I think he had a very brilliant book, We Have Never Been Woke, which made one point that I haven't seen get nearly enough attention in discussions about his book, which is that he really doesn't think it was necessarily cynical for most people who ended up benefiting from it. He argues in the book, in fact, that it would be very difficult to go on these kinds of moral crusades if you didn't believe in them, and that oftentimes people are very easily persuaded to believe that what happens to be just also so coincides with their own professional and social advancement. They're not always intention. The white racist
well, you and
editor,
me aside, I mean, we're completely unaffected by stuff like that.
Exactly. Exactly. It just so happens that the white racist editor who has this amazing job that I should probably inherit, is on the wrong side of history, and I'm on the right side of history. So I should remove him from his job. I mean, I think that there's something really to that these kind of ideas about how to improve society very neatly aligned with how people's own career trajectories would best work out. And so then you had, a situation that really alarmed me when I used to be, at the time in 2020, I was a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine, when the New York Times really became one of the key institutions that was captured by this kind of great awakening. And you had the editor of the opinion pages, the editorial editor, James Bennett, who was kind of sacrificed in, I think, a kind of collective exuberance of almost cult-like anti-racist fervor when he published an op-ed, or he oversaw the publication of an op-ed by Senator Tom Cotton about bringing in the National Guard to stop not peaceful protest, but to quell the rioting and the looting and the arson that was happening across the country. This was considered, and there was a kind of language that was copied and pasted across social media by influential Times employees, saying that this actually didn't just provide a platform for ideas that were disagreeable, but in fact put Black and brown colleagues' lives in danger. And so therefore it couldn't be something that could be debated. It had to be something that he had to actually be fired and purged. It just so happened that when he was fired, that, there would be the possibility of other people moving up in the organization and other people would become more influential. He was in line to become the executive editor there. So that was a kind of emblematic instance, I think, of how, as Hannah Arendt pointed out last century, moral panics and purges are also a kind of jobs program for ambitious junior employees, But that touches on one other element that we didn't speak about yet, which is really the technological component of all this. Why did it break through? Why did this happen? One reason it happened is because of the way that social media, the social internet, organizes our opinions and has us all performing our values at the same time that we're policing each other's performances. Right. It's kind of panopticon in which we're both the guard and the prisoner. And so I don't think that we would have the 2020 hinge moment were this to have happened before the advent of Facebook and Twitter and Instagram.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. You made some interesting thing you just said about it got to the point with those Times employees where sort of the underlying claim is this isn't subject to debate.
Right.
And I think that's key, right? Because it's arriving at the point where things, indeed many things, are not open to debate. That really, constitutes this almost phase shift in the discourse, or as you put it, the demise of discourse. How can you have discourse if so many fucking things are, not open for debate, right? I mean, if you can't question the assumptions of the person you're arguing with. So I think that's kind of key. And I think, and a funny thing about that occurs to me is the whole idea of the internet and then social media after that was it would facilitate the exchange of views among ever wider groups of people, right? And in a way, an unintended consequence of it, it becomes easier to arrive at this sort of strange sort of non-discourse where only certain things can be discussed. And discourse is essentially eliminated for a wide variety of things and for a wide variety of reasons. It's really rather peculiar. The more you think about it, the more we can talk to each other, the less we really talk to each other. So
that's right, because the way that the harshest and least nuanced expressions of a point of view are rewarded, and nuance is kind of the algorithm doesn't promote nuance. And so you have this kind of strange situation where the extremes of both camps kind of set the tone. And there's this kind of quiet, lurking middle that realizes that they may not, for whatever reason, have the stomach or have the professional stability to stick their neck out.
Yeah, just keep your head down. Yeah,
exactly.
Right.
So social media becomes, we're all talking to each other, but very few of us feel at ease saying what we actually believe, or the repercussions are too much to take the risk. So that's where cancel culture comes into this as well. The kind of policing of the Overton window to make sure by the kind of the most ardent true believers to make sure that nuance is not allowed to win the day. But one of the things that really happened that I think is key to this is that you can't debate identities. People's the ideas that were being discussed became inextricable from people's personal identities, and so that can't be up for debate. If you disagree with my identity, you're literally trying to erase me. You don't want me to exist, and that became the kind of tenor and the stakes of these kind of debates. And so it became a kind of zero-sum game of the exertion of power, right? And this was the peak, I believe, of the kind of, at least for now, in the short term, this was 2020 was when the kind of social justice identitarian left peaked in power and influence and control of mainstream institutions, if not of outright political power. But they also set precedents for a kind of zero-sum win-at-all-costs culture war that now you can see that the right is quite organized, if not in the cultural institutions and the universities, in the corridors of political power. They're quite organized at exacting a revenge and a retribution.
Yeah, they are indeed. They have taken down. We threw down the gauntlet to them, and they picked it up. And
they picked it up pretty quickly.
All right,
truly.
You want to fight? We'll fight. So yeah, it's been pretty grim. Going back to 2020, I was just thinking about your Harper's letter.
Yeah,
right, which comes out in July of that.
July 7th, 2020, exactly.
Yeah, okay, so I mean, had you formed your opinions as you just described them by that point, or was that still an evolving thing and you're just realizing this liberalism was spreading everywhere and you wanted to make a statement about it? And I might add, if anyone goes back and reads the actual Harper's letter, it's the most anodyne.
Yeah.
How could you object? This is like puppy dogs and rainbows. It's like mom and apple pie. It's like, hey, people should be allowed to say stuff. I mean, but it was a firestorm when you wrote it. And had you already realized how far things had gone, and that was really what motivated you to help put it together?
In fact, no, that was a quite eye-opening experience for most of us. I would say we didn't have, maybe J.K. Rowling, who was one of the signatories, understood how vicious the debates could be, but I hadn't previously been exposed to that level of vitriol. Had nothing to do, as you correctly point out, with the content of the letter, the 3 paragraphs that started by saying Donald Trump is the greatest threat to liberalism in America. And at the same time, there's a creeping censoriousness on the left that is making it difficult to have open debate, and that you can't really have justice without freedom. And freedom of expression is, fundamental to that. We should have a kind of society that emphasizes maximal tolerance that actually safeguards minority interests. These were the kind of points that the letter was making, but the point of contention that we learned very fast was, depending on how you looked at the names appended to the letter, what you read the esoteric meaning to be, what you thought the actual hidden message was. So if you looked at Barry Weiss and I don't know, Brett Stevens or some people like this, you would say that this was a Zionist letter and that this was anti-Palestine. That was actually quite surprising to those of us who had no experience in those debates and didn't even think of that as a possibility. But if you looked at it at J.K. Rowling and Jesse Singal and people like that, there was a lot of talk about it being actually a dog whistle because it was actually an anti-trans
right. Yeah,
letter.
it was a transphobic manifesto.
Yes, manifesto, in fact. And there were even people with huge followings online who actually decoded the letter and showed what the hidden esoteric meaning actually was and wrote over it with red ink. Yeah. That was eye-opening, and people were really taken aback by that. I certainly was too. And then I was more prepared for the kind of argument that this was actually a kind of white supremacist letter, and that, you know, people like John McWhorter and myself were kind of just like the smattering of black and brown signatures to hide that real message, that at a moment of greater awareness of racial injustice, some old boomer white men got together to decide to silence voices that were finally being heard. So all of that was the kind of meaning that was attributed to the letter. And it was really surprising to me. And even more surprising is that 5 years on, the feelings are very, very intense about that still. And people still mention it every week. Somebody will bring up that is, you know, an evil document that the signatories of it should repent for having put out into the public sphere. At the same time that they ask you to do a second letter to condemn whatever their pet issue is, we always get a request to do another letter.
Yeah, I mean, and as you say, those feelings haven't quite gone away, not just about the Harper's letter, but about, I think, one of the criticisms made of your book by several people, I think, is, oh, well, you know, he talks a lot about the left. What about the right?
Exactly.
What about the fascists? What about the Nazis at the gate? I mean, and if you actually read the book, I mean, you say lots of stuff that is like, good Lord, you're about as far from a Trumper as you can get. But it's just not enough, right?
It's
the
never
very
enough.
fact of criticizing the left is intrinsically downplaying the sins of the right and of the Trumpian populists. And I just find that staggering. That review in the New York Times was just brutal. I mean, but that's really all he had to say. He wanted you to write a different book. That isn't the book.
Right. Most people do want you to write another book. And just on a pragmatic level, what I don't understand about it is that whether it's fair or not, we can see that simply doubling down, tripling down on the criticism of Donald Trump isn't actually going to persuade enough Americans to reject him. It's not. Mm-hmm. There's not enough. We've done all the criticism you can do, and it doesn't mean that you cease criticizing. You call it as you see it. But I do think it prompts one, if one does not wish for Donald Trump and his vision of America to succeed, it must compel you to be more introspective and to consider what might have been done on your side or from the left more broadly that could make Americans step back, look at both sides and say that they preferred Donald Trump. The idea that you would say that now is not the time to think about those things strikes me as bizarre if you're actually trying to win back political power and you're trying to persuade Americans who don't live and die by politics day in and day out as news junkies. If you're trying to persuade those normal American voters that you have a more compelling idea for society, I think it demands understanding what went wrong before.
Yeah, well, you don't have to convince me of that. I mean, it also just seems logical, right? This is like, this way politics works, this is where people work. You're not going to really persuade people by basically just insisting the other side is really terrible. And don't ask me about what I stand for.
Yeah, we tried TDS.
Right.
We've tried that.
Yeah, and it hasn't worked too well, and it still isn't working too well. How do you sort of assess the roiling conflicted debate, if you can call it that, around the Kirk assassination? I mean, have we improved at all in how we handle something like this, or are people just going to their respective corners? I mean, certainly in terms of what we're just talking about, it's like, how can you criticize the left when the right is so terrible? I mean, this is like another iteration of that. I mean, how can you criticize me for criticizing Charlie Kirk when, Trump is going to do this and that? He's, they get Jimmy Kimmel kicked off the air. All these people are being fired. Cancel culture is run amok. Fascism is at the gates. So we just we've seen this movie before, but they keep showing it to us. So, I mean, do you feel like this has been an improvement at all, or just the same old of how?
No, this has been. I think this has been a worsening of the condition. I think that it's not an improvement. I do want to say that there has been some kind of, I think there has been an interesting response from Erica Kirk, Charlie Kirk's widow, and from aspects of the religious right. There has not been rioting. There has not been retributive violence yet.
So not.
There has been, I think, a kind of impressive desire in corners to use this tragedy to articulate their vision for society in a way that they believe is positive. At the same time, I think that our political leadership has behaved in ways that are genuinely alarming and dangerous, from the president and the vice president on down. I mean, I think we're talking about cancel culture. We're talking about, stigmatization and generating climates of fear in which people are afraid to say what they believe, or to speak up for what they think is right. The vice president got on Charlie Kirk's podcast and said to Americans, you should inform on each other. If someone's saying something that is bad, go and tell their boss. That's the most chilling thing I've ever heard. I'm
going to go out on a limb and say that's not good.
Yeah. I mean, but we're so inured to things happening that had not happened before that I think we kind of just shrug and say, that's that's Trump's America. Like, what's new, but that's actually that is an enormous escalation in the culture war. And it's not just Vice President Vance. It's also, there was a congressman in Florida who tweeted that if anybody knows of anybody working in the for the state in the universities or elsewhere who has said anything negative about Charlie Kirk, let his office know and they will be fired. And he was gloating that he already had he'd fired 2 teachers already.
Anything negative is not going to work, though. I mean, saying Charlie Kirk deserved to be assassinated might do it, but anything negative, I don't think so. But
even
this is the level at which things have gotten. People say these outrageously over the top things, and then in response, but one thing that I think that's interesting about the cancel culture, neo cancel culture on the right, is it's a get out of jail free card for people on the left who have been complicit in the past in cancel culture, and in some ways might even still favor it. It's like, how could you criticize me for any of this stuff? Look at what they're doing. So that's not healthy either. I mean, it basically encourages people to never really change their tune and to certainly think better of themselves than they probably should, given their previous behavior. So yeah, I mean, how do we break out of this, Thomas? I mean, now's your chance to tell us how we get out of this pickle.
Well, it can only be by a commitment to principles that can be neutrally applied. That requires not using the weapon of cancelization when your team has a bit more power than your opponents. But one of the arguments that I've seen made on both the left and the right that I think really makes me pessimistic that will be the direction that we move in is this idea that, well, look, now we can say clearly everybody cancels. It's just we just choose on what criteria. What is the basis for cancellation? It's not as though the behavior itself is not something we all participate in.
It's like a cafeteria of cancellation.
Yeah,
you make your choices as you go through the line.
And I think that's a development for the worse. It used to be that we would at least try to pay respects to the principle. And I'm seeing fewer people desiring to do that. On the right, Christopher Rufo and people like this have said quite explicitly, I used to be against cancel culture, but in fact, I'm thinking it actually,
about it.
yeah, it actually makes some sense,
so
actually.
Yeah.
So
right, I know. It's gobsmacking. So yeah, I mean, us like hardcore, no exceptions, free speech oriented liberals. I mean, we're not exactly taking over at this point.
We're not numerous.
It does seem we're not very numerous.
I mean, we have to persuade people. That's the tough work, and I think this is probably in my career, 15 or so years. This is probably the moment in which I feel that persuading people to that kind of center right, center left zone of negotiation and compromise and restraint. I think it's harder now than it has been at any point in my career up to now. But I'm hoping that I'm hoping that there's a kind of the polls keep saying that there's a large kind of normal center that doesn't feel at home with the illiberalism and extremism of the left or the right, that those are small percentages of the population. And I'm hoping that in some way we will have political leadership that will engage them. That's the other thing, is that writers and intellectuals and people who speak for a living can only do so much, but you actually have to have candidates that can transform those ideas into electoral victories. And that's where I also feel quite pessimistic right now. I don't see anybody within the Republican coalition, which really is now a cult of personality around Donald Trump, emerging to contradict that vision. And we are just bereft of leadership and kind of moral guidance among the Democrats. So someone might emerge in the next couple of years, but right now I cannot see that Gavin Newsom or anybody like this will be the figure that leads us back to sanity.
Well, that's a good, I think I agree with that. And again, I raised the interesting question, why is that? If it's true that there is this sort of vast middle, including big, huge sections of the Democratic Party who aren't, that into talking nonstop about how Trump is a fascist and wouldn't, don't really believe liberalism should extend in a uniform and uncomplicated and neutral way to everybody. They're normies, right? There's a lot of normie voters in the Democratic Party and even in the Republican. Of course, why isn't a politician out there among these leading Democrats who's just going to make a play for that middle instead of the activists? And, well, to be honest, a lot of the opinion writers who allege they're speaking for the people really don't. Is this just all because of the way the Democratic Party has evolved? It's dominated by liberal, professional, activist types. The primaries are a big problem. It's really hard for someone who is truly normie-oriented to get traction in the Democratic Party, despite the fact that you would argue there's a sort of untapped reservoir of votes and support out there.
It is actually that is actually, I think we'd agree that it wasn't how necessarily he was able to govern probably because he was in many ways checked out. But that is how Biden won in 2020, was a kind of promise to restore normalcy. Against both what people thought was abnormal about Trump's peculiar victory that they thought was an aberration, and also against the kind of excesses of the left. He was supposed to have done that, but we don't even really understand yet the extent to which he was in charge. I do
in discreet silence.
I do think that people like Gavin Newsom and Rahm Emanuel certainly got the memo that you're talking about and are trying to articulate that. But they're just, I think that they're too compromised by, the years that they've been in public life and what we know about them to come across as authentic enough. But, some young talent has to emerge that can articulate that kind of sanity without the baggage. In many ways, you can understand why. It's not my politics, and I don't think it's the politics that can win nationally, but you can understand why there's excitement around someone like Mamdani in New York, because in many ways, he does seem to actually be authentic. The left is bereft of authenticity right now. I think that's the main thing that held Kamala Harris back, and not just policies, but just the idea that she really doesn't have any beliefs, I'm praying for a miracle. I hope that the left will get its candidate, but I also hope that the right. And I got to be honest, this is the dilemma of the centrists. The right also has to be called out. The right is not generating candidates like Mitt Romney anymore who have a plausible chance of winning. The heir apparent to MAGA, J.D. Vance, in many ways is kind of articulating a vision that really only appeals to very far right online Twitter and X users. It's not something that speaks to all of America. It's really a divisive. At least
not now. Yeah, I mean, no. I think JD's a pretty crafty guy, and I think he would, if not moderate's correct word, he'd figure out a way to try to make the coalition bigger. But he's boxing himself in by all the stuff he's saying.
He is.
And the Trumpian Republican Party is a Trumpian Republican Party. You only have so many degrees of freedom. So even if you wanted to make that big play, I think it's harder. So that's why we always come back to the Democrats and say, well, at least they don't, they're screwed up, but they don't have Trump. They're smart people. But yeah, I think you're just so right about the lack of authenticity among the people who have sort of general election worthy politics. They don't. I don't know if you ever listened to Josh Shapiro, who I kind of like, but I mean, I've heard him speak a few times, and it's like, man, he's not going to excite anybody. I'm sorry. So,
I like him, but authentic is not the word that first jumps to my mind.
Pop into mind. So yeah, this is all a big problem. So. Well, we're, Thomas and I will continue working on this, and we'll have a memo shortly on exactly how let's be fixed. But I wanted to actually turn to, sort of your previous book and some of your other writings on race, because I think it's not uncorrelated with some of these problems about how the discourse has evolved and our inability to talk about anything in a halfway and have a vision for America, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm very struck with, the previous book you wrote and the subtitle Unlearning Race, and also some of the things you've written at times about Albert Murray and Omni-Americans and so on. I think most people don't even know who the hell Albert Murray was and what the idea of Omni-Americans was. It just seems to me it's such a beautiful idea. And I mean, maybe tell our audience a little bit about who he was and what he had to say and why it's so important.
Oh man, well, thank you for asking that. He's just one of these true American originals. Albert Murray. He died, I want to say in 2011, in his 90s. He was Ralph Ellison's best friend and friend from Tuskegee College. And he had a full life before he became Ralph Ellison had this kind of explosive early success with Invisible Man and became the most famous black writer in America. But Albert Murray went to the Air Force and was an officer and didn't begin really writing anything until he was in his mid 40s, and then went on to be extraordinarily prolific as an essayist and also a novelist. But his book that really, I think, makes his name is The Omni-Americans, in which he articulates a vision of American society, which is one that is mongrel fundamentally, that the American character is rooted in the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, the African, the Native American, and it has regional differences. There's the frontiersman, there's the Yankee.
Right, yeah.
And that all of these things are, you can't be, there is no American without any of this interacting. And that people that believe, part of his critique is that people that believe that the white American has no relationship to the black American are fooling themselves, and black Americans who believe that that they're isolated are fooling themselves, because he goes to quite great lengths to stress the degree to which the black American population is genetically quite white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, in fact, and that any fool can see that the white people are not actually white and the black people are not actually black if you just look at the shades of skin. And he's got a very eccentric way of writing and articulating these ideas. And, he's got a great love of culture and in some culture that you would be surprised by. He loves the idea of the frontiersman and the idea of the American setting out west and taming the land. But he also was a great lover of jazz music, and along with Stanley Crouch and Ralph Ellison, he founded jazz at Lincoln Center. And he's got some of the keenest music writing that I've ever come across. So he's just in the 1970s, he articulated this idea of omni America and the idea out of many one. And he never strayed from that notion. And I've kind of thought about the degree to which, my own life has kind of shown me, I've had my last book that you mentioned, Self-Portrait in Black and White, is about the experience of, having a white mother and a black father, but always understanding myself in this very American way of being black, because a drop of black blood makes a person black. There is no being part white or being mixed in the kind of tradition that I was raised in. So, when I had children, in my early 30s who presented as not even mixed, but just appeared straightforwardly physically white, it made me reflect on, what does it mean for me to be a black man who could have children that look like this? And what does it mean for my daughter or son to present in the world as though they're white, but to be descended from Black American slaves. And so I came to really believe that, we would never transcend racism so long as we believed in and swore allegiance to these categories. And so Murray was a part of the kind of process of making me rethink these things, but it was also combined with my own life experiences. And so I wrote this first person essay against race. That's a very long answer. I'm sorry to.
No. The more Albert Murray answer, the better. I mean, this is important stuff, and I certainly find it compelling as analysis. And partly this is just a good excuse to remind everybody out there: read your Albert Murray.
Yes,
Thomas and Ruy say you must read your Albert Murray. So yeah, the regionalization thing is important too, right? You talked about that a lot in your book about your father, right? He wasn't just a black guy; he was a black guy from a particular culture, particular area. That's important, And so to sort of one-dimensionalize you or someone like your father to just sort of this identity characteristic that is attached to your name is just ridiculous, and definitely limits us more than it explains things. Do you feel that, who are your kind of co-thinkers on this approach to race? So you basically think you're pretty similar to Camille Foster and Coleman Hughes and people like that. How do you position yourself within that constellation?
On this, I'm probably a bit closer to Camille. I don't think that Coleman argues for colorblindness, but he doesn't reject full stop the category of race. He might, I don't want to misquote him, but I think he might say that there actually are kind of biological correlations to demographic, to ancestry pools that that are what kind of lay people basically mean when they resort to the language of race, and that's not to be completely dismissed. Whereas Camille would define himself as a race abolitionist, and and I'm closer to that. I would, be open to the idea that there can be correlations of population pools, but that that humans haven't evolved for a long enough time for that to be racially meaningful. And so but if there were new evidence that were, on the genetic level that were presented, I would, of course, reevaluate my positions. But somebody that really impacted my thinking about this stuff was an artist and philosopher named Adrian Piper, who lives in Berlin. She actually,
I remember you seeing that name in your book, I guess. Didn't I?
Yeah.
So, but I, to be honest, I'm not very familiar at all. So, tell us a little bit about this individual.
She is really interesting. She's a Kantian philosopher, had taught for many years at Wesleyan, and but also was one of the most influential conceptual artists in the 20th century. And I met her, I profiled her for the New York Times Magazine in 2018 when she had a career retrospective at MoMA in New York, and was honored in a way that was extraordinary. She, I think it's the 6th floor special exhibition space that she was the first living artist to get an exhibition on that floor. It was usually reserved for, dead greats. And so I profiled her on the occasion of this, and she was, averse to doing interviews for many years, but I kind of emailed with her for months, and we struck up a conversation about race because in 2012 she had made this art gesture of retiring from being Black.
Oh, right. No,
Yeah.
I remember
which,
that. Yeah.
which I thought was it was clever. It was funny. She has a lot of humor in her conceptual pieces. And, she said, I've been Black all my life, and, I'm tired, and like, I'm done performing this labor and like allowing you to, this kind of in your like pointless bureaucratic organization. Like I don't need to do that anymore. And so I thought that was an interesting idea, like retiring from race, that, society kind of assumes that you will just participate in this language and this way of seeing and this way of seeing yourself. But it is on some levels, a choice you also make. Of course, your identity is a negotiation. It is not something that you can just determine on your own with no feedback from others. But you can determine how you present your side of the negotiation. And so I decided I would no longer kind of present the slave masters or the plantation owners like a way of seeing the world, and I would not raise my children to say that they were Black. I also wouldn't raise them to say that they were white. I would raise them to understand the fullness of their kind of ancestral heritage and to come to their own conclusions about what that implies. And I would stop defining myself in these terms too. I would stop marking boxes of small protests, but I wouldn't reproduce the language, the bureaucratic language of categorization either. And so we really did bond over that. And she showed me that it was possible just to even fight a feudal battle out of principle, but just not to be one more person playing what my late great friend Stanley Crouch called the all-American skin game.
Yeah, exactly. Boy, I endorse that 100%. Good old Stanley Crouch. I really enjoyed his writings back in the day, and he was a take no prisoners guy as a music critic. But
that's right. Well, he was a disciple, a protege of Albert Murray.
Is that right? Okay, They were all together. So
yeah.
Okay, so this is out of many one. I'm the Americans. You can make your own decisions about how you negotiate with your ancestry and how you conceive yourself. And let's throw away all these ridiculous categories and treat each other as individuals. And I'd say we'd be all better off if we did that.
I think that a lot of the problems
listen to each other.
Yeah, a lot of the problems we've been talking about in society would be alleviated if we could come with a common story, a narrative that understood us as having a kind of common culture. And I really do feel optimistic. I think that is the future that we will evolve towards. I don't believe that the kind of intense polarization and divisiveness that we're experiencing right now is the end point. But we have to figure out a way of telling ourselves a narrative about who we are as Americans. And I think that this idea of omni-Americanness is as good a story as I have come across, actually.
Well, I agree with that. I think you're absolutely right. I think I'm absolutely right. I think we're both absolutely right. And I think we'll leave it at that. And I do want to urge you again to go out and not only order Summer of Our Discontent, but Thomas's 2 previous books as well, because they're both great. And then you have the entire Thomas Chatterton Williams over, and you'll be a better person for it. So anyway, it's been great having you on the Little Patriot podcast. Next time you're at AEI, and it looks like you're going to be in the States for a while, come on by. I don't know if you have an office there at all or a desk, but if you don't, we'll just have lunch or whatever, and it'll be fun.
With pleasure. Sometimes I've been able to. I've borrowed Paul Ryan's in the past. I get set up for the visiting. Ryan. Yeah,
I get a kick out of that. Like the pictures of Ronald Reagan and all this. It's kind of I'm not in Kansas anymore. So, but it's all in good fun. So,
well, I'll look forward to seeing you next time I'm there. Thank you so much for having me on.
Hey, thanks for doing this, and till we meet again.